3, 2.
B2B marketers, we're back with B2Beacon's third annual installment of our Leadership and Luminary series. I'm your host, Thad Kahlow, CEO of Business Online and Chief Editor of B2Beacon. Well, we are again here in the lovely windy city of Chicago, home to some of the best T-Bones, Deep Dish, and of course, B2B Marketing Association and event, the BMA, now ANA. And we are fortunate enough to have Rachel McClary here, who is the Vice President of Global Marketing of Diebold. Rachel.
Thanks
for coming.
Appreciate it very much.
How's the show been so far?
Outstanding. Some really great content, some amazing speakers. I've been able to walk away with some good learnings and some best practices.
And I understand you're going to be educating over 1,000 of our B2B marketers tomorrow with a fire starter speech, if you will.
That's right. Actually, it's a 30-minute, it's a general session presentation.
Oh, wow. So we're at the keynote level here.
Yeah.
I'm going to get my facts straight.
That's okay. Yeah, I'm very honored to have the opportunity to share some best practices and the experience that I've had over the last 15 years or so in my career on transforming marketing organizations in general. So regardless of your industry or your go-to-market model, taking some key constructs and applying them to taking an organization that is traditionally what I would call an order taker, a group that's reactive and sort of executing very tactically someone else's plan, and transitioning that and transforming it into a more strategic contributor and an organization that's proactive in nature, and what I term an order taker to a playmaker.
Order taker to playmaker. I
Yeah.
love it. So what are the key pillars to evolving? Because I
Sure.
obviously can't be something that happens overnight. What are the key components of making that actually move from order taker to playmaker?
Mm-hmm. There's really two rules of thumb that to be applied, and they're very simple. And basically, it's organize and simplify in 4 constructs. So the construct takes 4 topic areas, and thinking of that term about organizing and simplifying against these. The first is around the people. So the structure in general. How are you going to structure an organization where you can optimize the work and the spend in a way that can simplify that organization so you remove your redundancies? The second piece is around your framework. So, here at BMA, there's been a few jokes about the fact that B2B marketing tends to be, the redheaded stepchild, or the one that, not necessarily fighting for the budget. And I talk about winning share of the corporate budget by having a framework that's simple and organized in a way that allows you to articulate the value of marketing as a function to stakeholders outside of the function. So folks that don't necessarily understand marketing, and I joke about the fact that oftentimes when folks outside of marketing, you ask them, what do they do? Yep. Usually the answer is, well, they know whether or not you have to give a pen or a coffee cup at the event to get the most badge scans. Or, that's the place you go for the golf balls before I have my client event. The perception oftentimes of marketing outside of the function is very myopic. And so being able to quantify that value in a way that can be articulated simply and organized really helps with kind of that credibility, because the transformation all boils down to establishing credibility quickly with your stakeholders.
I love it. There's a lot there, and I'm going to press on the first piece that I heard that I think is interesting is having those conversations with stakeholders outside of the marketing world and understanding them, and hopefully them understanding you. What do those conversations look like? When is it a good conversation, and what are the things you're looking for, and when is it heading in the wrong direction, and how do you course correct?
Oh, great question. You can tell it's heading in the wrong direction when the conversation starts with, okay, Thad, I have a list of 16 things I need you to go execute. Where it starts to get interesting is when we can have a collaborative discussion about what your goals are, the approach that you're going to use to get there, and then how marketing can contribute to those goals. So we can take any industry. And if I'm sitting down, and very often, obviously, sales is a key stakeholder for marketing, I would sit down and I would say, okay, Thad, what's the revenue goals for the year? Okay, where's the growth going to come from in terms of the segments? How does that mix look? What are the approaches and the key places, the key solutions that you want to lead with in terms of those messages? And then we build sort of the framework around the campaigns or the ideas and the plan to support that. That's when it's a collaborative discussion, is always the right direction. To be able to talk in your language and be able to apply the marketing know-how and the expertise into your world is really when that chat becomes more collaborative and more of that playmaker level than an order taker.
So you're really identifying goals, so you can have some level of empathy, so you know from a sales perspective, you know that they have a certain quota that they need to meet, so we're all understanding that, and then backing into, okay, this is the plan for us to get there together, and aligning those efforts.
Exactly, and then also being able to track, measure, and report it. So I talked about that framework, right? Being able to organize in a framework that you understand, and that knowing that the tactics that I employ aren't always about leads. Right, so very often, folks associate everything that marketing does has to be a lead. In reality, it doesn't. There's so much more in the portfolio that marketing can contribute to, that by me talking to you and giving you that framework and educating you on those priorities, that when I'm communicating back, we have an agreed upon definition of what success really is.
I love
it. That's where that conversation goes.
This is another great point. So, measurement being a huge key piece of this, so we can all understand whether we're contributing to that ultimate goal or not. Mm-hmm. What are the most important metrics that you like to look at that can tell you that you have a healthy, marketing and sales pipeline, or unhealthy, mm-hmm. and how you react to it?
Much like what the folks at Mercer just talked about, it's a blend of qualitative and quantitative. And so the framework that I typically use has 5 priorities within marketing. And they're both qualitative and quantitative. So something very simple, which is intuitive, is demand generation. Sure. So obviously you and I are going to talk about demand gen in a way that leads to sales accepted leads. That's cut, clear, easy to kind of identify. Where we start to get into some that are a bit more on the qualitative side is around something like a thought leadership or awareness. If we're trying to establish a presence or a voice in a new market, or really get above the noise in a particularly crowded market, what I'm going to talk to you about are tactics and approaches that aren't going to lead to a lead necessarily. Yep. It's more about the voice, the reach, how I'm reaching to the target market. Am I identifying the right contacts? Do we know whom we need to speak? Those types of pieces are really much more important. So those metrics become more qualitative in nature and less what I would call, less sticky or tangible in that way.
Sure. There's the notion of awareness and influence, and having an ability to build a relationship early on before you move them into a potential opportunity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are the approach that I take. There are 5 marketing priorities. That first one, demand gen, as I had mentioned, very clear cut in terms of the creation of net new opportunities for the sales organization to pursue. The other is sales acceleration, which is taking existing leads that have already been sort of nurtured and created and accelerating them through the buying cycle.
Sure.
Then we have the thought leadership and awareness, much more along the lines of voice, presence, something new in an emerging market or an emerging space. And then we have the only internally focused objective, which is around sales enablement. So making sure that the client-facing community has what it needs to properly position and sell what we have to offer relative to those pieces. And then lastly, it's about loyalty. And this is 100% based on relationship. And so very often, depending upon the industry and even geographies, the relationship and the culture of that relationship is very important. So again, one of the less tangible and more qualitative pieces is around how often or what can marketing do to create the opportunity for that client-facing individual to engage with the customer or the target. Yep. And that might not be about a lead, that just might be about a low-pressured social opportunity to be able to have the benefit of 2 hours in something that's very casual that then leads to a more structured conversation about follow-on engagements.
I love it. And what about the notion of this, the rise of what we call the revenue marketer, that the folks are actually not only empowered but are held responsible for contributing, sales to the bottom line. Mm-hmm. Where do you sit with that, and how does that work within Diebold?
Yeah, I get a little nervous when revenue is tied to a marketer, and the reason is it's sort of, you can bring a horse to water, mm-hmm. but you can't have them drink. So marketing's ability to influence revenue. I'm a fan of influenced revenue, meaning that sales raises their hand and says, absolutely, that without marketing's contribution in their efforts of these collective tactics, I would not have been able to close this deal. I absolutely am a firm supporter of that. I don't necessarily believe, though, that marketing could be a sole contributor to revenue in a way that would be substantive.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
There's good debate around that, right?
Yeah.
I love it because I think there are folks that are in your camp that are saying there is high level of influence, we should be held to those metrics, and others that are taking on a quota, which is interesting. And I think this is kind of a new era of how this is all playing out at this point.
I agree. It comes down to accountability versus ownership, right? And maybe certain industries or certain places, I tend to be a bit more of a traditionalist in that way, but the risk factor and marketing's ability to actually close that deal you know, and the tolerance of that function to be able to accept that type of accountability without owning the result. So in other words, if I'm relying 100% on you as the sales organization to close that deal, then being held to that in terms of performance, and if you're in a performance-based culture, that's your livelihood.
Oh, yeah.
That's how you feed your family.
Yep.
That becomes a real, maybe a healthy tension. It could be, but yeah, I'm not sold yet on that.
I love it. Let's talk a little about the notion of playmaker. So obviously, this is the progressive, non-reactive place where most marketers should be if they want to grow themselves, their careers, and the importance of the organization. When you think about that and you look at your strategic roadmap, what are some of the play makings or initiatives that you're actually putting on the table that you're trying to achieve in the next 12 or 24 months?
Yeah, great question. These are introducing, again, being firmly grounded in the plan and in the strategy, and being able to take those 5 marketing priorities that I talked about and using those to be able to highlight the plan itself. So what are the tactics? What are the initiatives that we're going to be able to track, measure, and report against to our stakeholders?
Sure.
What becomes really important is the prioritization, right? So I talk a lot about being able to do a few things, so concentrating your efforts to do a few things well versus many things poorly. Again, it's about the credibility. So being able to, you know, be considered that playmaker as someone that can have a seat at the table and be able to engage in that conversation at a business level.
Yep.
And apply the marketing elements to that. So for Diebold, one of those things, they're like many of these century-old companies that we've seen at BMA 15, have been the reinvention of themselves to be able to remain relevant in their industry. And Diebold is no different than that. And
Sure.
so what we've done is, again, under this guise of organizing and simplifying the message to the market and shifting, much like GE Locomotive did with their shift from the product-centric out to the outcomes-based
Yep.
approach. So it's the typical inside-out versus outside-in. And so being able to shift the perspective of a company, not just from what you're sharing externally from a marketing perspective, but also culturally getting an organization that for the last 50 years has sold a product in a way that is simply a product.
Yep.
Do you want to buy this and this and this and this, versus saying, okay, Mr. Customer, what is your challenge? And we understand that, and being able to elevate the conversation.
It's hard, right? Because
it's not easy.
there's so much ingrained history and culture in wanting to tell the market why your product is great and what the features and functions are, where with the growth and explosion of advertising, that doesn't work anymore, and you need to be able to understand what the outcomes that are important to your customers are and how you're solving problems. But that shift, it seems so obvious, but it's hard to do. What does that time period look like? What are the conversations you're having to evolve to that era?
Yeah, so for Diebold in particular, the timeline that I set from the marketing's perspective in terms of this transformation is about 18 months.
I love it. You had a timeline.
Realistically, right?
That's fantastic.
And I constantly say, I think the single most contributing factor to the failure of any transformation is trying to do too much too soon too quickly.
Yep.
And 0 to 100 in 4 seconds, just the market can't consume it. Internally, they can't consume it, and trying to become too sophisticated too quickly really sets you up for failure.
Yep.
So having a realistic timeline and taking it at what I would call digestible chunks really helps relative to that piece. And so there's the transformation of marketing as a function, but there's also that cultural transformation.
Absolutely.
In getting those sales reps confident and bought into this process. So, introducing this idea of, guess what, you're not going to talk about this product anymore. It's going to be about these 5 business objectives that your client wakes up every day thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
That reaction initially is one of complete and utter skepticism. You're crazy. This isn't the way we do it. This isn't how we sell. And it takes a significant amount of time to be able to establish a credibility and get them bought into that process. And so that's equally a very, very long timeline to be able to
that with the stick or a carrot?
A little bit of both. A little bit of both.
I love it. And what's marketing's role in terms of actually helping to facilitate that? Is it helping on the product pieces, the scripts, the folks that you're targeting? Like what are we doing?
Yeah, that all falls under that one priority of sales enablement.
Yep.
So it's in the form of client intelligence, market intelligence, competitive intelligence at that level. So elevating from the product-centric to the customer-centric perspective. So giving them the synthesis of a client profile on their their 10K and their annual report, what are their objectives and their high-level initiatives, and helping them see that map together. So expecting sales or relying on sales to make those connections is naive.
Yep.
Really, especially in a transformation. So being able to help them see and connect those dots together at that level really helps accelerate that adoption.
I like it. I'm always interested to learn the perspective of folks like yourself, Rachel, who sit in the role that you do, who are in transformative roles, and how you have conversations with executive management, CEO, if you will. And from that perspective, if in an ideal scenario, what report or dashboard or metrics are they looking at from a marketing perspective that you think is most important for them to understand and manage?
It goes back to the credibility. It goes back to that framework. So the idea or the concept of these 5 priorities that are intuitive and easily understood, and most importantly, believable.
Yep.
So I've been in organizations before where you mentioned about the revenue, where these outrageous numbers about marketing being connected to tens of billions of dollars worth of revenue by, as an example, if marketing sends out a direct mail campaign to 1,500 customers, and then because someone in that account opened up that email, then marketing takes credit and tags every opportunity that account is responsible for in terms of its contribution to marketing's influence on revenue.
Yep.
And that's a real problem. And so when I talk about it being believable, those metrics underneath those intuitive priorities really helps establish that credibility very quickly. So CEOs typically have 1 or 2 objectives as it relates to marketing being able to support. So in Diebold's instance, it was around the reinvention of the brand into the market. And so those expectations and those metrics are very different than if it was to grow dramatically in terms of increasing market share.
Sure.
So those priorities shift over time, but being able to really get that CEO and that senior executive level to hone in on that one single objective, or maybe 2, so that you can align against those metrics, really helps in being able to, when the time comes to be able to start reporting against them, that we're all on the same page.
I love it. One of my favorite topics, and I think it's kind of a hot topic these days, especially from a B2B marketing perspective, is the notion of data. This notion of big data. You can call it big or small. It doesn't matter. I mean, very often I think in the larger B2B companies, it's even still small sets of data. If you're thinking about it from a web perspective, how do you see data enabling this transformation within the companies or a company like Diebold, and how that actually supports your efforts?
Yeah. So it's things like this, big trends, and scare me a bit, only because the pendulum swings from one side to the other, and I'm cautious on what I'm going to call the cyber stalking concept, right? I think that there's a fine line relative to the data itself. Being able to mine that data and use it in an informative way to help make decisions and prioritize the marketing efforts can truly help. So for Diebold in the financial services industry where we are, our customers are banks, they're financial institutions, so banks, regional banks, credit unions. For us, when banks are traditionally very conservative with their information, being able to balance sort of their behavior as it relates to web analytics or what they're interested in, and being able to come back with an informed reaction or sort of a retargeted message has to be carefully balanced to avoid any type of concern relative to going beyond their comfort level as it relates to those pieces. So for this industry in particular, we need to monitor that very closely.
Of course.
I would say in level of maturity, it's in its infancy.
Sure.
So, you sort of have that crawl, walk, run type mentality where I talk, too much, too soon, too quickly. This sort of that crawl phase. I'd almost say that banking is almost in utero. It's not quite born yet. Where a little bit behind the times, it's so highly regulated, and in terms of what you can say and with whom you can engage and how you engage, that time will tell on that one.
Interesting. I love it. So two last questions I've been asking of everyone. What would be your career advice for other folks in the B2B marketing world in terms of what they should be focused on to progress themselves within their organizations? And then secondarily is, what advice would you give to your peers from a strategic standpoint that may not be currently on the roadmap that probably should be as they're thinking about progressing within the organization from a marketing perspective?
Sure. So if I talk about my peers, so that would be the top leader of marketing in a corporation. I think the biggest thing there is you're looking to make sure that you have established credibility with people outside the function.
Yep.
That is I think the single
Huge.
most important thing, and applying some collaboration, keeping those communication lines open, and that metrics, that agreed upon success of what that looks like is critical. That framework that you need to put together to be able to articulate that value, you need to be an advisor of the function, and you need them to be advocates of that function. And that's, I think, the best way to protect the function in general, because marketing is an overhead, right? And every time there's a cost cutting measure, overhead line items are the first thing to get looked at, always. And so when we already have a dwindling budget, being able to sort of protect that in a way of having those outside influences and those stakeholders be advocates is critical.
That's a great point. Very often overlooked, an excellent point.
Yeah. Thanks. So, and for folks that are looking to advance inside marketing, I would say become students of the function and learn from the outside. So, training and development very often inside the organizations that I've been have always fallen. It's always the last thing on the list that people just don't quite get to. Yep. And I think it's so critical to have a solid career plan, to have a development plan, to reach out to opportunities and events like this where you can collaborate with peers and learn best practices and bring them back into your industry to apply. I would highly encourage folks to look for memberships in organizations like PMA and others where they look for their passion and then they go after that.
Rachel, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, my pleasure, Thad. Thanks
so much.
That was
fantastic.
Thanks.